Welcome to the Human Performance Outliers podcast with your hosts, Dr. Sean Baker and Zach Bitter. At Human Performance Outliers podcast, we dive into a wide range of topics revolving around health, nutrition, and physical fitness. If you enjoy the show and wish to support us, please visit patreon.com/HPO podcast. If you do not use Patreon but still wish to support us, please also consider checking out our PayPal page at paypal.me/HPO pod. The link to both of those can also be found in the show notes. Finally, please consider subscribing to us on your favorite podcast listening platform. Now, on to the next topic. Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. I've been kind of rearranging some stuff since then, and we have this in our house. It's like a lot of the houses in Phoenix here, where there's like these big cement privacy walls that go around, and we have this really nice shed kind of in the back corner of that. Nice. I decided to clean it out and kind of move the podcasting stuff in there, but I haven't gotten around to making it climate controlled yet. So right now it's just miserable to be out there. So I've been doing a lot of the recording here, but it has great sound in there, and the lighting and stuff is perfect, and it's far enough removed from the house. My wife and I both work from home for the most part, so I don't bother her as much rambling on about low carb diets and endurance.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a nice spot when it's not 110 degrees outside, but
yeah, your weather is brutal. I have a client. He just said, I just got back from Phoenix. He had a bike fit with some company, and he said, it was 110. And he goes, he lives in San Diego. He says it was rather scorching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I dream of San Diego this time of year, but we're pretty fortunate in the winter months. And I grew up in the Midwest, so I just loathe the 20 below wind chill, snowing outside when you've got a big training thing on the schedule.
Yeah, so, the Midwest is harsh. I had a roommate from college that was just out here, and they've lived in Incline, which is in Sierras, and and they get a lot of snow. Those specific storms come in, and he said, I just got so tired of it. He's just retired a couple of years ago, and they've gone down to Palm Desert, and they said, well, we kind of extended our time with COVID, and he said, the winters down there are pretty darn nice, and he said he doesn't miss that snow.
Yeah, when I lived in Sacramento, actually, this was something I was going to ask you about, because I think you grew up in Davis, right?
Yeah, I did.
Not mistaken. Yeah, I lived in Davis for about a year, and then Sacramento for about maybe a year and a half each of those before moving to Phoenix. And I would make that drive over to Reno every once in a while. And so I remember I found out about chain tire regulations and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So Midwest, they don't do that. You just plow through it. Huh?
No, there's not enough hills in the Midwest. You don't got to worry about that. I remember thinking, why are these people so worried about snow? They're really soft out here. And then I realized, there's 3-mile descents at 8 to 12% grade. You can't just scoot down those when they're switchback and back and forth.
Yeah.
So thankfully, I learned the protocol before making too big of a mistake. And they don't let you make too many mistakes, though. They'll stop you and pull you out if you're not
right.
Chasing your tires. So
yes, they do.
Cool. I threw us up. We're recording now, so we can hop right into this and
sure.
And kind of get your story here. I know I'm excited, obviously, to have you on the show. Our listener base is kind of pretty wide ranging. We've covered a lot of different topics between the endurance stuff from my side. My co-host historically, Dr. Sean Baker, he's taking a break from the podcast right now because he's just had so much going on with all his stuff, his individual stuff, that he would bring in a lot of folks that were kind of strength-based athletes. I don't know how much you know about Sean, if anything, but he's literally twice as big as me. He does explosive sports stuff.
Does he? Wow.
Yeah, he was a rugby player. He did Highland Games, all sorts of stuff.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yeah, so it was kind of a polarizing tandem we had in between the extreme endurance and the short explosive stuff. So we got a lot of
folks. It's a good mix.
Yeah. No, it was fun co-hosting with him. But right now I'm going solo, so we can dive a little deeper into endurance, perhaps. But
good. Whatever. I'm real big on the strength train. Always have been for. When I was racing, I did a lot of it. I came from a swimming and water polo background. Water polo, those guys are big behemoths now, but so I had to be strong for that. But I kept it up all the way through my triathlon career, and I'm a big advocate of it. A lot of the athletes that I've coached, and a few of them that have gone on to do well, Chrissy Wellington, who was a world champion, and Craig Alexander, they were really asymmetrical when I first, they were already good when I got them, and I didn't want to muck them up, but they were pretty focused on their strength training and mobility training, just keeping the range of motion in their shoulders and their thoracic spine and hips. And so, yeah. But
has strength training been a pretty standard part of triathlon for a while, or is that something that community kind of had to learn over the years?
Well, I've been involved with it for a long time. It's something that I brought in. So when people would ask me, they'd say, well, what do you think about strength training? But it certainly is the first thing that's given up. If people want to go out and ride their bike longer, that's what they'll do. And, to a fault, a lot of people do, sort of steady pace, all the same speed over distance type training. And it really unfortunately affects their physiology. And you know this well, they just don't get any faster. Mm-hmm. So they get in a race and, they're not doing a, race across America. There's a finite set amount of time. You got to be fast. Mm-hmm. So, I've always been a big advocate when people have asked me, yes. And what should we do? And I can give them all the science and research and find out their strengths and weaknesses. And here's your program. But for most of the triathletes, it's really not innate that this is really paramount, that they should be doing strength training. It's something that, I heard that from Dave Scott, but I don't really want to do that. And I may add it. And a lot of people do it in their off season, which I think is fine. But where they really need it and where they're more vulnerable is when they become fitter, and quite often their volume is greater. And then they've now curtailed it or dramatically reduced it or brought it to zero. And then all of a sudden they go into the race and they've got these little niggling injuries and they're just not quite as strong. So I've seen the cycle and triathlon a lot and I'm sure it's prevalent in distance running as well. And I've worked with some distance runners. People get in good shape during the springtime, and then all of a sudden they think, well, I got to go faster. I've got to do more volume. And all of a sudden they kind of go up to this plateau where their fitness is really solid. They're doing well in the early season races, but they're not shining at the end because they're, so I think a big part of that is doing the strength training.
Yeah. I've always been a fan of strength training too. I think that the endurance running world has just come a lot more in the last maybe decade or so than they would when I first got into running. But yeah, it's like it was mindset that and you're gonna get too big and you're gonna have to carry all that extra muscle around when you're trying to run these long races. And then when it started to get a little more popular, it's like you'd go and you'd see the runners, they'd be in like one corner of the gym and they'd just be doing, like 100 reps, low weight type stuff. And and that's where I think it really confuses people in the endurance world is like, you actually want to be doing some of those more like kind of core movements and try to actually add some weight to it relative to what you can do yourself. But a lot of my stuff is like early in the season, maybe up to 10 reps, but by the end, like when I'm in like kind of peak season or even doing some races, I'm down to like pretty low reps, under 5 for the most part. I think you get that base or that foundation in place, and then you just kind of have to keep triggering it every once in a while. And it's amazing what you can do with a little bit of time if you just stay consistent with it.
Yeah, it's magic. Well, I'm glad you're a big advocate of it as well. And a lot of the endurance people, not to be redundant on your comment, but they end up doing too many reps. They don't take the exercises to hardy fatigue. And I use those two words a lot because there's a great return on a compound called a myokine. These myokines go up a lot, and you're also stimulating predominantly your fast twitch 2A fibers for endurance people because those kick in. So I always tell them, just don't sit in front of the mirror with the 2-pound dumbbell doing bicep curls, for an hour. I say, you're better off just having dinner. I said, put those down and, let's put a little bit of load on there. So yeah, that's awesome that you're doing that. I remember reading your bio before you did your 12-hour world record run on the treadmill, and you said, "Oh, yeah, I like doing a lot of top end stuff. I do a lot of lactate threshold type workouts." And I thought, good for all those endurance guys that just think more is better. And I think combine that with your strength training, obviously you've had great results.
Yeah, I think it gets interesting, especially when you kind of get into like Ironman triathlon and then like 100-mile races where like you are going to be out there for the entire
Right.
day.
Right.
And it can get easy to get sucked into that, like, oh, I need to be spending 5, 6 hours, out in the mountains or the trails or
Yeah,
wherever
exactly.
on a regular basis. And I think there's definitely a place for that, but you can also be pretty strategic with it. And that's one thing I learned throughout my career, I think, from an ultra running standpoint when I got into it. The reason I got into it because I love that long run. Like that's what I
Yeah.
wanted to do. I
Right.
was,
Right.
do this every other day, and
Yeah.
and eventually you learn that doesn't work as all that well for the long haul. And there's times a year where it's better to go short and fast and
Yeah.
pick some weights up every once in a while.
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to actually ask you about that type of stuff was with like kind of like the programming side of things with us, especially like Ironman. Do you guys typically address like certain systems like kind of exclusively, or do you do more of like a blended approach where you're doing like VO2 max type workouts, lactic threshold workouts, aerobic threshold stuff, all kind of in the same block of training?
Yeah. Well, I think first off, when people try to put the whole kitchen sink in one training program, and then all of a sudden they're doing lactate threshold workouts and anaerobic endurance and VO2 workouts and over distance, you're going to wear yourself down. So I have what I call microcycles or periodization, which people are familiar with that word. I'll use one of the examples with a couple of the world champions, Craig Alexander and Chrissy. I always thought it was paramount before they're going into their biggest race of the year, which happened to be the World Championships, Ironman Kona. And I always wanted them to be at their kind of their peak strength. So we always did a VO2 block, very specific, for about 6 or 7 weeks, and we would do that on the bike and also the swim. And it'd be one specific session, VO2 session for the bike, one on the swim, leading into Ironman racing. It wasn't, oh, I need to do more volume as we're coming in, because their aerobic machinery was fine. The blood volume is fine, capillary density is fine, but their mitochondria are really stimulated by, not to be too technical, but by doing the VO2 train load. So getting to your question, they were really, it wasn't, all types of train all at one time. I think that's not a good approach, because the athletes get fit and the athlete will say, oh, I can do a lactate threshold workout, I can do a VO2 workout, I can do this speed work. And I said, no, you can't. And you'll do your, because you're going to wear out. And it's going to be counterintuitive. So I do these microcycles, and for example, the VO2 session at the end, I would do a sort of a sub-threshold session during that same week. But if I did a lactate threshold and a VO2 and did them back to back, I would have put them under the covers. They would have been smashed, exhausted, and the VO2 workouts themselves aren't very long, but as they're pretty darn uncomfortable. I mean, if you're doing 5 times 5 minutes, which is kind of about the maximum total sum 25 minutes that I use, that was enough. And and I did this on the run as well, with them not leading up to Ironman, but we did VO2 blocks on the running as well during the year. And I usually had 3 VO2 blocks of each discipline throughout the year. They really somewhere between 6 to about 8 weeks each. And at the end, as I said, we did a swim and a bike leading into Ironman, VO2 specific, which I thought was, and have always thought that, even when I was racing, that was one of the key elements to making sure they're ready to go fast.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't aerobic machinery.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I know it was always funny to me, because when I came out of college, during the season, we would be doing a lot more blended stuff. But when you're racing like, 5K to 10K, you kind of almost need to be touching a lot of different systems. Right. You get this little tight season of window. But since kind of skewing way to the longer stuff, like I'll definitely like subgroup my or I'll subdivide the different systems, and kind of usually my general approach, or what I tell folks, is I start with the least specific stuff early in the season, and then I work towards the most specific stuff to what I'm going to do race wise. So
Right.
in most cases, if I'm peaking for 100 miles, that means like the VO2 max system stuff is, assuming the aerobic base is already there, which unless I get injured or something like that between seasons, I'll probably be at least fit enough to maintain most of that. And then I'll move into like more lactic threshold focus, kind of in that middle third. And then when I get to be like, say, 6 to 8 weeks out from the race, then I'll start just like kind of doubling down on a little bit more of the longer stuff, or the intensities that are gonna be specific to what I use on race day. And
Right.
I haven't tried throwing back in the VO2 max at the back end though, but maybe that would be a useful thing to try out for the next go around.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously you always want to look at the best of the best because they're doing a lot of things right. So, I can sit here and say, gee, Zach got to do this. Well, you're pretty darn good, but I would, I would
pull my hamstring on a VO2 max workout
yeah,
2 weeks later.
Exactly. Well, and I think a lot of people that on the outside would say, well, Craig and Christy are world champions. And I would say that doesn't mean they're at their pinnacle.
Mhm.
I said, there's always areas that they can improve, and you better dissect their workout to figure out where their weaknesses are, maybe how you wiggle the training blocks during the seasons. It is good to combine at least two different energy systems. So there should be an anaerobic component that you're doing. And a lot of people in their sort of off season or build season, even if they're doing everything, pretty much aerobically, I have them interject these little higher intensity segments. I call them anaerobic endurance. It parallels good physiology, but typically between about 25 seconds to around 50 seconds on the run, sometimes up to 2 minutes as they get more fit. On the bike, you can stand up, sit down, you can slide fore and aft on your seat, and you have more variability on the bike. And the swimming allows you a little more recovery, but kind of the sweet spot to start people like in the off season, I have them do 25 seconds to 50-second repeats. And when they start off, I just say, well, don't slam these. Do them as start off quick and do them as a buildup. You don't want to pull your hamstring, or you don't want your kidney to fall out. So, but I think it's kind of paramount that people, athletes, look at stimulating those fast twitch fibers, not just wait for, I'm going to run fast, or now I'm going to swim fast. And it's something that you get a lot of growth by doing a real nominal amount of higher, faster segments. And this, what I call anaerobic endurance, is really great data. If you've never done it, about 4 to 8 minutes, the sum of this total time, you can start reaping the benefits. But for athletes that have been doing it, I typically work in about a 10 to 20 to 24 minutes of total faster stuff within a workout. So let's say you're doing a 2.5 hour run, you might throw in 15 minutes of faster segments in there. And I've always found that the transition to the next phase is easier, and their muscles are primed to go a little bit faster. And, as the coordination when you run fast, it feels unwieldy if you haven't done it for a while. You think like, wow, what are my arms doing? And, your body just doesn't flow.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I guess I may have sold myself a little short, because I do, when I'm in that phase where I'm kind of building up the volume and race day intensity type stuff, which for me for 100 miles, usually like aerobic threshold is kind of where that, like, I'm probably not going to be touching much above that, except unless I'm feeling really good at the end of the race and I'm kind of just bringing it home. But
right.
I'll do like either like 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off type of setup, or 30 on, 30 off type of stuff, as
right.
In the contest, just to kind of keep a little of that turnover, a little bit of that strength, where so I'm just like out there slogging around the entire time every day.
No, it's good. I mean, a lot of people, when they do a set like that, depending on the weather, higher humidity, obviously you don't have it in your home base, nor do I have it in Boulder. But if you're doing this in Houston, humidity is high. A lot of people say, gee, I tried that 30 on, 30 off, and I did a few of them. but I needed more rest because your heart rate lags behind it.
Yeah.
You feel the heat overload. You can't dissipate your heat. And I said, yeah, you're better off trying to hit the speed and give yourself just more recovery in between. So quite often in the early part of the year, if I prescribe this to athletes, I'll tell them to just get in 12 minutes of these faster bits and do them between 30 seconds and a minute or 50 seconds and spread them out within your workout.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're still stimulating, and they might do some a little bit after the warm up, midway, and then towards the end. And the sum of it is by definition this will help their physiology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've always liked looking at kind of volume with some of the lower or the higher intensity things, kind of in the framework of like, well, how much volume did you do during the week, and like how you cut it up. I find, especially when you're in a sport where it's kind of foreign to race day intensity,
right?
That like, like if I try to do, and the numbers you mentioned are basically what I operate up. I'm always trying to build like maybe 20 to 30 minutes at the VO2 max type of stuff.
Yeah.
And, whether someone cuts that into 2 workouts or, has a little more recovery versus the one on, one off type of framework is like kind of a secondary thing. Like if we can make it work, we'll try to do that. But, people oftentimes have other things to get done too, or other issues that pop up for whatever reason. So
right.
You give them a target that's manageable, I think, and they get that done and get most of the benefits. And then if we want to fine tune it from there, we can. But cool. Yeah. So, I mean, I think maybe we should just since we've been going now for about 25 minutes, officially introduce you to the crowd, because we had a triathlete on a while back named Pete Jacobs, and he won Kona, I believe, in 2012.
Yeah.
And the reason we actually had him on was because after he won, he had a bunch of digestive issues or autoimmune issues, and he was talking about going on a 0 carb, almost like animal-based nutrition approach to clean up his digestive and stuff like that. But the reason I mentioned that is just because our listener base, if they pay attention to triathlon, obviously they know who you are. Some of them probably do anyway. But just to give them an idea of kind of where your history was within the sports, and kind of where what's your claim to fame, I guess is what I'm asking, Dave.
My claim to fame, Zach. Well, I'm a senior citizen now. I mean, I kind of fell into the sport and it didn't have any definition. I mean, the first triathlon I did, it wasn't called triathlon. It was in San Francisco. The water's frigid. It's November, and I was just finishing up college in 1976, and I took a group down to San Francisco, and I said, "Oh, we're going to do this event," and it was started off with a bike ride, and then and there was no order, no police, no one at the intersections. It was just mayhem. It was chaos, and do it how you can get through this thing. And then the second leg was about a 4-mile run. And then the last leg was to jump into the bay. And this was around our Thanksgiving time. The water was 56 or 7 degrees, no wetsuits then. And I was honestly, I wasn't even going to do the run. I was having some foot trouble, and I thought, I'm not going to do this. And I kind of ran in college with swimming and water polo just to stay fit, and I enjoyed doing it. And I thought, these multi-sport events would be kind of cool. So anyway, I jumped into that one. I have no idea whether 3 or 4 guys were ahead of me. I did decide to do the run and jumped in that frigid water. And I remember seeing one guy who was hanging on the chain of this boat. The anchor was set down, the bottom of the bay, and this guy was wrapped around this thing. And I think he had a total body cramp. And I thought, well, maybe I could help him, or just, I'm competitive. So I kind of hollered at him like, "You okay?" But I didn't really listen for his answer. And so I ended up winning that race. And I thought, well, this is kind of fun. I hope more of these things, whatever they were, would pop up. 78 was the first year of Ironman. People took note of it, but it was really just, it was really for oddballs, and no one really trained. No one had any idea. I did it in 80, the third year. And I went into it, just with a blind optimism, and said, I'm just going to go as fast as I can. I don't think I'm not going to die on this. And I, didn't know the competitors. There were 108 people that year. And I led from the swim and never saw anyone. So, my debut, I won, but, coming across the finish line, I think like a lot of athletes, when they do something the first time, and certainly in your realm, you're thinking, gee, I know I can go faster. I wasted time here. I want to do this again. So that was really the start. 80 Ironman. Then I ended up winning the Ironman in 80 and 82. There was 2 races in 82. I was second in the first one. I won the second one. I won in 83, 84, 86, 87. I was second in 89. And then I had a 5-year hiatus, and I came back when I was 40 in 94, and I was second that year. And then my final one was 96, and I was 5th when I was 42. So that's kind of my career. People know me as this, Ironman guy, but I did shorter races as well. And during this whole time, my background's in exercise physiology, and I kept thinking, well, there's no career in this. But I started picking up sponsors. There was prize money. Ironically, in Ironman, the first 4 that I won, they gave me a crummy looking T-shirt. There was no money. One of the islanders who lived there, I think he felt sorry for us. He said, "You guys have got to put money up for this event," and so he did. And so on my 5th win in 1986, I got $8,000, and then 10 from the same guy winning again in 87. And I think it humiliated Ironman. They decided we better put prize money. So the sport's evolved a lot. We have the World Championships, as it's been denoted in Hawaii, is there every year, but the half Ironman, or 70.3, has moved around the world, and there's over 130 events. Obviously, having COVID, everything is on hold, and we're all looking at 2021. So that's kind of that's a summary. I've been coaching athletes. I have a Dave Scott Tri Club membership program. I have runners and mountain bikers and triathletes in it, and I'm my thing is always, give them as much information as I can. And I've always taken great pride in that. But at the same time, I've given people a lot of, I'll say not misinformation. At the time that, the science was pretty compelling. And if you have closed ears to the other side of the science, and certainly the low carb, high fat and keto side was there when I was racing. And there was good investigative science in that, but they weren't getting the notoriety and the attention that they have over certainly the last 7 or 8 years. So my diet has gone through lots of different iterations, from eating as many carbohydrates as I can to being, Mr. Keto.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always interesting because I sometimes pay a little bit of attention to kind of the triathlon world, because it just seems like that community has put a little more time, energy, and money into kind of looking into like, well, what works and what doesn't work, and how do we actually prove this, versus the ultra running community, who's kind of still like a little bit wild west with like kind of what works and what doesn't work. And we've certainly learned a lot over the last 10 years, but there's still kind of enough disagreement or enough uncertainty where I don't know that there's necessarily a gold standard approach at the moment in a lot of cases. Certainly not for someone who's like kind of a middle of the pack, or maybe a little more clarity up in the front of the pack. But it is always interesting to see like the nutritional stuff. And I know I was even reading something, I think it was with Mark Allen was talking about what he was eating back in the, like, I think it was mid 80s, early 90s. And he was like, just maybe a little indifferent to just like being too hung up on like, I need to have a majority fat or a majority carbs, and just kind of ate like a blend of it all, but focused on like real foods, and just ended up eating like a pretty, what I would consider a decent balance if you're just looking at it from like a quantity standpoint between fats and carbohydrates. And I thought like that was kind of interesting, because like back then I would have imagined they were really like kind of just sounding the horn for like 70% carbohydrate or something like that, or 80 in some cases maybe. But it is interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think Mark, maybe intuitively said, I need more healthy fats, and was eating more. On the other side of the pendulum, I was all about eating carbohydrates. And eat almost any form of carbohydrate as well. I mean, I eat a package of rice cakes, and rice cakes it's not even rice. It's been cooked and recooked and matted and pounded, and it's about as nutrition as wallboard.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I would eat these carbohydrates because I'm hungry, but it stimulating my system, as a lot of athletes can get by with it. And that's the problem, is that they say, oh, Dave Scott, you won the world championships, and you were very carbohydrate dependent. And my response is, yes, I was able to win those races, but the fluctuations that I had in training, and really ultimately the inflammatory response, which you're very keenly aware of, over time is building up. And when the day comes, and maybe I'm an anomaly in some ways because I still exercise pretty darn hard, without changing my diet, those inflammatory markers would be keenly elevated. And I was listening to a podcast by a woman in Australia who's she's an MD, and I can't think of her name. And she put up a set of slides, and she said, "Do you recognize these athletes?" And these were athletes kind of during my era, and some a little bit older and some a little bit younger, all different sports. Basketball players, Billie Jean King was one of them, Earl Monroe, basketball player. And I just saying, yeah, I know them, I know that person. And then she put up a tagline next to him, and the tagline was four or five had type 2 diabetes, 2 or 3 had Alzheimer's. They all had degenerative diseases, which can be attributed to diet. And her point was, I think a lot of athletes do get away with eating like garbage cans, and not really recognizing that there's an inherent long-term destruction in eating poorly, even though you're able to perform well. And so my response was, gee, I wish I didn't have such a closed door to low carb, high fat, or ketogenic diet back when I was racing. I would have gone faster. Somewhat of an arrogant response, but
Sure.
but at the same time, there's a lot of validity to it, because as you have been practicing, I have as well for several years now, making changes in my diet. I tried vegan, I tried lacto-ovo-vegetarian, which was a good change. And then I started adding cold water fish, which was a better change. And then all of a sudden, was looking at, gee, I think I probably should eat more olives. Those are good for me. And maybe those hard cheese is fine. So, that shift has come over time, and it's, I've let go of the blinders and said, I've always, again, looked at the science, and now I've looked at it in great detail. And that's what I share with the athletes as well.
All right, folks, Optimal Carnivore reached out to support the show and let you know about a product they are very excited about. Optimal Carnivore recognized that organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, but can often be difficult to prepare conveniently and hard to get when eating out or traveling. For this reason, Optimal Carnivore has created grass-fed organ complex and bone marrow complex. They do this by sourcing 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand, freeze-dry the organs, and encapsulate them into a convenient bovine gelatin capsule. They chose New Zealand because it is a pure source, a pristine land with rich soil, lush greenery, and one of the cleanest environments on Earth. The products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished and free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. The grass-fed organ complex is a unique blend of 9 different organs, a powerful combination including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and intestines. The bone marrow complex contains the same components as a home-cooked bone broth, perfect for people who are traveling or who do not have the time to make bone broth. All the nutrients and substances that your body uses to build, repair, and maintain your bones, teeth, and connective tissues. In an effort to add even more to these benefits, Optimal Carnivore plants 1 tree for every product sold, which helps the environment. So go visit www.amazon.com/Optimal Carnivore and use the code HUMANSAVE10 to receive 10% off your purchase. Links and the promo code can be found in the show notes. All right, now back to the show. And I think it's also interesting too, because like you said, like you can get away with a lot of stuff earlier in your career, just as a young individual in general. But then when you're putting in, like in your case, probably 20 upwards of 30 hours of training in weeks, like you got to get in the fuel, and sometimes like you just end up going to whatever's available or whatever's there. And the way I kind of described it to a lot of folks is like, hey, because some people say, well, why is nobody doing this just kind of intuitively? And I'm like, well, blindfold yourself and walk into a grocery store and just randomly pick stuff off the shelf. And I bet you're going to come out with at least a moderate carbohydrate diet.
Right.
Like unless you just stumble upon like the lard aisle or something
Yeah.
like that on accident.
Exactly. That's hidden over there in the corner, but those carbs are everywhere. Yeah, get some grains and cereal. You can tank up pretty fast.
So yeah, I always just wonder how much of, especially when we're getting into these longer effort things like Ironman triathlon and 100-mile races and things like that, where you're burning a lot slower than what someone would be doing in like just an all-out marathon or something even shorter, that like Olympic distance stuff. And I mean, I think that's maybe a little more of a gray area from what we're doing, but at the same time, I think there's at least room for some questions to be asked and hopefully eventually answered. But yeah, and I think like that's the one thing that I'm always curious about too, is when you see these like this life after sport, because when you most of these sports are getting competitive now, where like you just aren't going to be like pushing into a normal career length at the end of your competitive. You're going to have probably a decade or two worth of like working kind of timeline left on your table when you finish your last competitive race. And it's like, well, what are you going to do with that rest of that time? And, you don't want to just be a shell of yourself. You don't want to be wrecked. And if there's two ways to do something, and one is going to kind of give you what you need when you're performing, but also put you in a position to be successful afterwards, it's like I'm taking option 2 every time. And the more stories I hear about, folks ending up with like diabetes and things like that post-career, is just makes me more happy that I've kind of put my stuff or my nutritional approach in a little bit of a different category than the norm. And I do always wonder though, like with some of that stuff, like how much of that is like you doing a 20-30 hour training week and you're just pounding all the sports supplements and things like that, and anything refined is going to go down easy. And if you're eating that much, that might be what you turn to, especially if you're doing 2 or 3 workouts in a day. It's like, then you stop doing that. Did you kind of set yourself up in a position just to have like a lifestyle that is going to make it like damn near impossible to scale down to what your retirement energy demands are going to be and things like that? And that's why we see some of these athletes kind of like turn a really bad corner after they finish their competitive career.
Yeah, there's a lot that turn a bad corner. I mean, I think the simple answer is, and people that are skeptical and say, I feel healthy, look at me, I'm the same weight as I was in high school, and I'm doing all this exercise and on and on and on. My simple response is you should have a complete blood panel done. And the basic blood panels that are certainly done in the States are really kind of simplified right now, but you can add different markers on there that will really give you a real broad overview, from fatty acid levels to vitamin D3, which they've taken off right now. A lot of people are really low. Magnesium levels, serum magnesium, which you can check, hemoglobin A1C, C-reactive protein. There's a whole slew of them. I send it out to people, and I was just actually with a roommate of mine from college last night and had dinner, and he's my age, and he just said, and he's had some issues, and I said, well, I'll send you my blood panel, to take to your physician, and they're just outsourced to five different companies around the U.S. that does the testing for this. And I said, then you're going to get a definitive look at whether or not you just have amazing adaptive physiology and great genes, and you eat like a garbage can, or you're eating what you think is a healthy diet, but it's not, because you're going to get a lot of these markers that are going to show up. And even if you're on the upper extreme or on the lower end, depending on what you're looking at, if a good physician or medical person is looking at this, they're going to say, you know what, you're kind of on the road to prediabetes. Your fasting glucose levels are way too high, and that set point can creep up. So to your point, Zach, a lot of the athletes, they're pumping in foods all the time, and so their insulin levels are going up, and they're developing this insulin resistance and leptin resistance, and their blood glucose levels, fasting blood glucose, all of a sudden start creeping up 5 or 6 points. Well, they're already on their way to possibly bad problems, and when they're in their done with their careers and maybe they're in their mid 40s or their 50s or 60s or 70s or beyond, it's not too late. But again, I tell people in their early 30s or late 20s, take a look at it. Well, you got nothing to lose.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like at best, like you having these situations where even if you didn't do all the damage during your career and it was like the post-career, like lack of like exercise
Right.
coupled with the same diet, you kind of put yourself in a position where you're one bad decision away from, becoming like full-blown type 2 diabetic. And like you're better off being a couple steps away from that. So then if you do make a mistake or something like that, you're not in a position where you're already kind of at the end of that rope. But
Right.
yeah, it's interesting. And when I mentioned before, when we had Pete Jacobs on, it was just interesting. One thing he said, he's like, the other thing that always gets overlooked with a lot of this stuff is they'll say like, well, we surveyed the top finishers at Kona or the top finishers at this competitive race, and like every year the top ones are the ones who are able to take in the most amount of carbohydrate. And I'm like, that's great, but like you also have to look into things like, well, what is like the dropout rate? How much digestive issues were occurred during that? And you look at that side of the thing, and we're seeing like a coin flip chance basically that your race is going to get derailed by a digestive issue. So when I kind of just describe to a coaching client or someone who's interested, like, what direction do they want to go? I tell them, I'm like, if you're the type of person who can get away with eating 400 plus calories an hour during this event, and that's what you prefer to do, then like, there's a chance you'll run a really, really good race, but you're also have like, I think it's like a 60% chance in ultra running for single day events that you're going to develop some sort of stomach distress or digestive issue along the way too. So, most people I'm working with, they're not professional athletes. So they're going to do a couple of these in any meaningful way every year, and they're going to spend 4+ months preparing for it. It's like, do you really want to flip that coin on 4 to 6 months worth of work and hope that 400th calorie at hour 8 doesn't like send you running to the toilet or have you puking in the bush somewhere? Yeah. And, depending on the person's like risk tolerance, I guess will depend a little bit on, or their past experience too. I always find the folks who've already experienced a lot of digestive issues are the ones that are a little quicker to look at a way to maybe minimize their inter-race fueling frequency and minimize the amount of like engineered fuels they're going to need to take in on a daily basis to even prepare their stomach to be able to tolerate that.
Right.
So, I mean, it's interesting because like I was talking to someone not too long ago and they said, well, you just got to train your gut. It's like, I got to train my gut to be able to eat 400 calories of sugar an hour. It's like, is that, then we're back to square one, like we were talking about before, where, is that a position I want to be putting myself in just from a health standpoint, where I'm going out for a 60-minute easy run and taking in a sports drink because it's just better to learn how to digest while I'm running? Or do I just defend muscle glycogen in a different way?
Yeah, it's a real, it's a gross mistake to look at nutrition that way. I mean, you're not really training your gut. And the top athletes, and I don't know anecdotally what you referred to, they're not taking in more carbohydrates. And the question I always ask athletes is, under like train conditions, what is your intake? So when you go out for a training run, using your example, let's say they're going out 90 minutes or 2 hours, what would you take? What would you have for your pre whatever that is? And that preloading is a real misnomer because, as you know, they're going to have to burn through that glucose first before they start oxidizing fats. And a lot of times that does lead to GI distress because you're drawing water into your stomach and you've got this bolus of food. So typically the answer is, oh, I would never do that in training. But in a race, I think more is better. And I just said, that's idiotic. Because you really want to try to minimize the intake for all the reasons that you brought up, and not try to be overzealous with the amount of food that you cram into your gut, thinking that more is better. and I get this with athletes, all levels, pros and amateurs in triathlon. Oh, I'm going to do an Ironman, so I got to make sure that I'm eating X each hour. Well, the pace is slower for a lot of these people. They're going to go 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 hours in the race. Their caloric burn, if we're looking at that, is pretty minimal. And if they're not overloading themselves, they've got liver glycogen and free fatty acids and protein catabolism, and the amount of circulating blood sugar that they need is really small, but yet they can pollute themselves by pumping down a lot of calories early on. And in triathlon, a lot of them can get away with it on the bike because they're sitting there, but when they start the run, as you know, in your sport, and you're working with or against gravity, all havoc can break loose, and they're hitting every porta potty. So it can be a disastrous day. So less is generally better, even for someone who is carbohydrate adapted. What do you normally do if you're thinking about going to low carb, high fat? I mean, that, or keto, that the caloric intake, just looking at calories, it's not a calorie for a calorie, but it's typically 30 to 80% less than when they were sugar dominated. So using your extreme example of 400 calories an hour, and I've heard this in my sport, they're going to be at 200. But if they're really oxidizing fats, they don't need 400. 400 is extreme. That's awful. When I get athletes that say, "Oh, I'm taking in 300 calories an hour," I say, "Well, you better be going 35 miles an hour on the bike," and no one does that for 112 miles. So some of the notions about nutrition that athletes have and the misconceptions that they have is the same thing that parallels training. More volume is better. More food is better. Man, I'll throw those out real fast. No and no.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you have like a situation where like they look at you look at like a study that's done, and it's like you can glean from that more would be better on paper, but like more, that's kind of like in a vacuum that leaves the digestive situation off the table, which obviously has an upper limit. I think the position paper for ultra running single day set was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour is what they were mentioning.
And that's still a lot. That's 200 to 280 calories of carbohydrate. That doesn't count do you have any other fat sources or protein sources with it. And a lot of the studies, even with American College of Sports Medicine, they'll say, well, the body, you should be taking in 90 grams of carbohydrate. That's 360 calories. And that's printed throughout lots of papers. Like, your body can handle 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And again, it comes back to the same thing we've been stating, that is that what you're trying to do, is to force feed yourself so that you have the capacity to not get gut issues or having to hit the porta potty or dive into the bushes or whatever. It hits lots of people. They have GI distress.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic. And I think one thing that I found really interesting when I first started to, take on like a high fat, low carb approach was just kind of learning, what do I do differently the week leading into a race, the night before the race, the morning of a race, and when I start a race. And the thing I found interesting was like I'll have a little bit of carbohydrate the day before, but the morning of, like everyone seems to be eating like cereals and like pancake type stuff, bread, cereals, that sort of stuff.
Right.
And, when you look at that approach, you're just like, you're encouraging your body to go to tap into those glycogen stores or burn through what you ate first and then start probably continuing down that route, versus going a little lower carb or abstaining from carbs the morning of, and then not fueling on carbohydrates for that first like 45 to 60 minutes, especially if it's like a longer event, like what you or I were going to be doing. And then you've kind of turned that fat burning engine on, and then you can start bringing in a little bit of carbohydrate and defend muscle glycogen. But you're in a position then where you don't need that 90 grams per hour in our sport.
No, you don't. No, I mean, it's and we've all kind of filled with that. I mean, you've gone through it and made the change. And I when people ask me, what do I do now? Well, we're both involved with S Fuels, and one of the nice products that they have is that S Fuels Train, which really has no calories, and we're burning non-carbohydrate sources. depending on your metabolism, anywhere between 30 minutes to up to 2 hours. So even the sessions that I do now, I don't eat in the morning. I don't have breakfast in the morning. Quite often, if I go out for a ride, which I did today, I had the S Fuels train. That's all I did. And then I swam afterwards. I just had S Fuels train. So my first meal today was at around 12:30. And because I feel alert, my energy level is great, and I don't need that crazy amount of calories we've been discussing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the train in the life has been a cool product because I've been using it now since the beginning of this year.
Yeah.
And I found, because I'm the same way, I wake up, I do my biggest workout usually relatively first thing in the morning. I usually give myself about 45 minutes to 60 minutes to kind of like wake up and, get ready and stuff like that. But yeah, using that instead of like a solid food is just, I love that. I love having I don't want to have like hunger pangs, but I want an empty stomach when I go out
Right.
for a workout, and a
Right.
couple scoops of that's been useful. And if I do wake up and I'm hungry from like a big training block from the previous days, then the S Fuels Life Bar is usually what
Yeah.
I'll go to for that.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's kind of it's interesting because when you look at just like carbo loading in general from its kind of original positioning, where like, which I think got bastardized when like kind of road marathoning kind of got popular,
Yeah.
where part of the experience was this massive pasta feed the night before.
Exactly.
And I always wondered, felt like people, well, they kind of like carbo loaded before that day too. So they spent like Thursday carbo loading, Friday carbo loading, then you go to the pasta feed and carbo load even more. And it's like, you look at carbo loading strategy, it's like you actually abstain from carbohydrate for a few days before you did that bolus of carbohydrate, even in the context of the moderate to high carbohydrate athletes in a lot of cases. So no one was doing that first 3-4 days of the week though, where they abstained.
Right. No, it was always the same thing in triathlon, is that they'd have the pasta parties, and it was just mountains of carbohydrates. And even way back when I was a carbohydrate guy, and I'd see these guys just gorging themselves, and I said, well, they're going to have a rough day.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a prelude to this just doesn't seem right. And do you ever do this, before your great training day? And none of them load up all week and then load up the night before. So yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of preaching the same thing over and over again. And I've told people with GI distress, carbohydrate adapted, and maybe thinking about low carb, high fat, just to try to take in less, and taking less at the outset of their race, as you just mentioned, or their training day, and most of them feel better.
Mm-hmm.
It's a simple recipe.
What are like target fueling ranges that a lot of your clients are using on Ironman days, like intra-race?
Well, again, big difference, because I have athletes that are carbohydrate dependent, adapted, and then I have some that are low carb, high fat, that have fat oxidation rates 1.2 to 1.5. And so they've been able to dramatically cut back from their carbohydrate days. And again, I had a lot that are carbohydrate dependent, anywhere between about 175 to 300 calories per hour, predominantly carbohydrate, a little bit of protein in that. And now, again, the low carb ones are at least half of that, if not even more. And so that first hour is very, very little. And then for each hour after that, it's less 50% than the numbers I just gave you.
Mm-hmm.
But as I mentioned, if I find an athlete who tells me, particularly a male, that I need to have 300 calories an hour, I just I got to talk them through, the logic on this and what they've done before. And I don't, anecdotally, we kind of have to follow, well, I've done this before, and therefore it's the right way. There's some leverage on their side in saying that, but at the same time, you also want to present, good science and reasonable facts on maybe diminishing that amount that they're taking in. So that's what I do. But again, a lot of the carbohydrate athletes, 175 up to 250 is a really big range for guys. Women are about 25% less than that, less muscle mass. The low carb keto ones and I have some that are between about 55 to 110 calories per hour. So I know, Dan Plews, who has the Ironman age group record, he took in a lot of calories on that day that he did that. And, I was kind of surprised because his fat oxidation rates were quite high. You were a good example when you broke your 12-hour record on the treadmill, that your caloric intake, and you use predominantly S fuels, was pretty low.
Yeah, I think on the treadmill I did like 15 or 16 packets of Race Plus. So it
Yeah,
would, and Race Plus is interesting too because they're about 100 calories in a packet of that,
right.
but it is was it 4 grams of fat and 3 grams of protein, and then like 15 or 16 depending on the flavor of carbohydrate. So it's a little different. Like historically, I would usually like if I would have like a mixed drink, it would be almost all, if not all, carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So like I like kind of having that blend.
Anyway, you're relatively low. The Race Plus is a cyclic dextrin, so it's absorbed without getting a huge insulin surge, which is a real asset for a lot of athletes because they're not relying, as opposed to drinking a can of Coca-Cola. It's quite a different chemical composition of the two different types of, if you want to call them foods, Race Plus or a can of Coke. And a lot of athletes gravitate to grabbing some simple sugar that really has a toxic level of sugar in it. And anecdotally, athletes have done well. Well, I just grab for that Coke at the end, and I'm always grateful that they get across the finish line without exploding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think that there's a reason it's at the end and not throughout. I've done.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah,
Well, and
so
it kind of goes back to like what you were saying before too. It's like you get folks who can get away with it, or at least they can in the time being. And I mean, I was kind of in that same boat. Like I started out doing your typical kind of whole food, high carbohydrate diet, and uh, I started my ultra running career with that approach. And I was taking in 300-400 calories an hour for like 50-mile or 80K races.
yeah,
And I could tell at the end of those though, like I'm getting to the point where like if I would you know, even if I could run another hour, which in a lot of cases I couldn't,
yeah,
but if I could, like I wouldn't be able to stomach another hour worth of food.
yeah,
So I knew when I was gonna be doing 100 milers at some point that I'd have to figure something out. And I mean, obviously I'd probably need a little less for 100 miles just because the intensity is going to be lower. So I'll
yeah,
be better ratios. But once you start looking at like the fat oxidation rate stuff, I think my last test, I was like 1.56 grams
yeah,
for my peak fat oxidation. And then when you kind of scale into those numbers a little deeper at like a heart rate of 155, which for me is right about my aerobic threshold,
yeah,
is like about 85% fat and
yeah,
15% carbohydrate.
yeah. It's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah. So 40 grams has always kind of been the ceiling that I felt like I've ever needed during a 100 miler, where I'm going to float up to maybe 155 beats per minute.
yeah,
And that's even got a little bit of cushion in it probably. So
yeah.
my thought was just like essentially at 40 grams, if it goes in smooth, then so be it. If I have to go a little less, I can get away with a little less
Yeah.
and kind of go from there. But yeah, Dan was on here a couple months ago, and he was talking about I think he said he did 50 grams for that age group record. And I can't remember what his fat oxidation rate were, his max one. I think it was maybe a little lower than mine.
I think it is lower on what I've seen him print, but not much. I think it's about 1.4. But
Okay.
even on his, on the run, and this goes back to when I was racing, because there's a cumulative fatigue, and we're not having the output that you do on the swim nor the bike. Most people, and I've said even this with the world champions today, that they're not even running at their aerobic pace. And I realize there's a little bit of a heat load, like in Kona, for example, but Jan Frodeno, who holds the world record in Ironman right now, broke it in 2019. His pace on the run is a pedestrian pace for him. So his energy demands are relatively low. He's obviously oxidizing fats. And when Dan did his age group record, I guess I can say this not arrogantly, his run's relatively slow, as Jan Frodeno's is. Comparatively, for example, in a half marathon or 70.3, Jan's run legitimately 106. I saw him do this in South Africa off the bike. A 106 for 13 miles is darn fast.
Yeah.
But they're nowhere close to that when we're doing the Ironman distance. He's running 2:43. So, it's relatively slow. And therefore, if coming back to Dan, he's taking in 200 calories an hour of race plus on the run, I would be surprised. I never did when I did Ironman. I got to Ironman and didn't have the information that I have now. There was no need to take it in. And so, on an hourly basis, actual run time, when Mark and I ran an 89, he ran 2:38 and I ran 2:39. It's 2:40 and 2:41 in the books. But even in that race, I was taking in about 150 calories an hour on the run, not very much.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was carbohydrate adapted, but my fat oxidation rates were still pretty darn high then. And I think, again, if there's a point to all this discussion is, people really need to kind of pare back the volume that they're taking in. They'll probably find they're going to perform a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's interesting stuff. I like to have options and things to choose from. And that's ultimately like where I think I land with a lot of this too, is when I was teaching, one thing I knew I would never do is walk up to a student and tell them, here's the one way you have to do something. And if you don't do this, you're going to fail. Yeah. But I walk up and I say, here's like 2 or 3 options to choose from. And then, here's the reason they want this one, or this one, and kind of walk them through that. And then they're going to do what they want to do no matter what. So at least you kind of given them some options and some reasons to do something. And I feel like more people are kind of receptive to it with that. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, well, it's hard to mandate. We're not robots, so everyone has different physiology, and you can't mandate that this is the exact protocol. It's just, again, it parallels training. You can't give the same template that your competitors are doing and apply it to you, or vice versa, and reap the same results. So there's got to be a little bit of wiggling on that. But I always try to look at, what are the best doing? That doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but you better look at them. Mm-hmm. And then what does good science, tell you on this, and how has that evolved? So I think when people become stagnant, is they say, well, I've done this for the last 30 years. And I said, well, it's probably outdated. Let's change it. Okay. And
surely we've learned something between then and now.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of old dogs out there during my era that are still doing the same thing. And, you made reference to the running community, the triathletes as a whole, I'm not trying to put a flavor or a slant on them, have embraced technology. They've embraced technology on the bike. I rode the first aero bars that ever came out, and then it gravitated to cycling. And when I first started riding, it was all about wool shorts. Well, wearing wool cycling shorts is, it's dreadful. It's like sitting on a bucket of sand, and, it's just awful. And so the technology with fabrics changed. I mean, it didn't matter whether it was wheels or derailleurs or food. The evolution of it, you better look at it, and you better get information from great sources so that you can make a more constructive decision on what I should apply to yourself. And so I have always kind of go through this whole wheel, as you alluded to, with athletes, not trying to give them the overall historical perspective, but giving them the latest so they do understand that there is evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I don't want to keep you too long, because I know you're a busy guy. So that might be a good spot to end on. But I do want to make sure that you can share with our listeners like where they can find you, social media, website, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I'm all over just because out of necessity on Instagram and Twitter. I always tell people, just Google my name. It sounds pretentious, but there's an astronaut, Dave Scott, and there's a black musician, and then it was a felon up there a while ago. It was Dave Scott. So I'm the other guy who did triathlons. That's a pretty easy way to find me. And I have an outreach to a lot of athletes. I haven't had this Dave Scott Triathlon Club, but I like answering a lot of questions. So I have people sending videos I have a newsletter. It's free, and we have pretty big distribution. It comes out twice a month. and we cover topics that we just discussed, Zach. So people can sign up for that. There's no, I don't have all their credentials for the rest of their life. To me, it's a good information piece, and they can ask me specific questions. I answer about 90% of them that come in, from Achilles tendonitis, which just happened to a woman in her 50s riding her mountain bike, to plantar fasciitis, to I can't get overhead reach front end on my freestyle stroke, to I got GI troubles when I exercise. So kind of a myriad of things, but I'll say I'm fairly easy to find.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Hopefully some of the listeners will go over and check out some of that stuff, and they can learn from the 6-time Ironman World Champion, Dave Scott. Thanks a bunch for coming on.
Thank you, Zach. Enjoyed chatting with you. Went by quickly.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey folks, Human Performance Outliers podcast is growing, and due to the growth, we are looking to take on some new sponsors. So if you feel like your company or organization would be a good fit for our audience, please do not hesitate to reach out to hpopodcast@gmail.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with hosts Dr. Sean Baker and Zach Bitter. If you enjoyed the show, please consider following us on social media and checking out our websites. Links to those can be found in the show notes. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to shoot us an email at hpopodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning into the show.